Thank you, Rami, for being here, for agreeing to speak to us. And I thank also the Association of European Journalists for organizing this webinar. I actually think it's sorely needed, this kind of conversation, especially in places like Bulgaria, where it feels that the media coverage of this war has been very one-sided or very, very subjective. I think that's true of most places actually in the world. And just a quick thing to say is that when I was a reporter in Iraq back in 2010, it seemed to me that the reporting on that war could happen in a much freer environment, so to speak. That any kind of like criticism, whether of the American forces there or of the Iraqi government, it seemed that the media environment seemed much more conducive to serious professional journalism. What we see now is something completely different. I think we've never seen such polarization of reporting, and it's very hard, I think, for audiences to make up their minds to find really professional, objective reporting without a lot of emotional bias. And I think we need journalism of this sort to be able to sort out through the very complex issues that are happening. And so my first question to Rami, I know it's a difficult question, but why is reporting from this war, about this war, so difficult compared to other conflicts?
Thank you, Dimitar, Maria, Martin, the interpreter, and the AEJ for hosting this, and everybody who's been involved in making it happen, and especially for the audience that's listening in. It's a great pleasure for me to do this. I learn things that I've never learned before because I've never interacted with Bulgarian journalists before. So this is part of the process of constantly learning about journalism and learning from colleagues around the world. This is a very polarized, as you said, Dimitar, it's a very polarized environment, and it's reflected in the media. The reason this particular conflict is unique and particularly raises the importance of the media's role is several things that have never happened before. We've never had the scale of killing and destruction and warfare that we are seeing in Gaza now, to the point where the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, said there's plausible evidence for a genocide by Israel. We've never had this level of warfare. The second reason that this is unprecedented is that the foreign media Israel has not allowed the foreign media to go into Gaza. Therefore, most international media reports from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Cairo or Amman or somewhere. Very few are in Gaza. There are some in Gaza, but they tend to be the regional media, Jazeera, Turkish TV, one or two others. And the third reason this is so difficult is that the media is a target, particularly of the Israelis. The Israelis have killed journalists and attacked media offices for decades in the region. But in this one, there's various figures that go from 95 to 150 journalists have been killed, assassinated, and most of them targeted, because it's not that they died in a big explosion. They died driving in their car or their home was bombed. So that's another reason for this. And the fourth reason is that it's historical, and I can't get into all the history, but never before, and this is a 100 years conflict, by the way. So the first thing that people need to understand is that the Zionist movement, which became the State of Israel, has been fighting against the Palestinian national movement and its many supporters in the Arab world. They've been fighting for 100 years. It was actually 1923 but almost 100 years, but almost exactly 100 years ago, that the British government, the UK government, got the mandate from the League of Nations to administer Palestine, which was under Ottoman control, and prepare it for self-determination and statehood in theory. In practice, what happened was that process led to the creation of the State of Israel and the dispersal, exile of the Palestinians, and that war has been going on ever since. But it started 100 years ago, and what's new here, what's really important here, is that never before have we, everybody is involved in this, have we seen a situation where there has been such massive international involvement in the conflict on both sides. So you get the American, the Europeans, say the British, the Germans, a few others. I'm not sure where Bulgaria stands on this, but massive, severe and enthusiastic Western support for the war, for Israel's genocidal war, openly expressed, refusing to have a ceasefire. And on the other side, you have virtually the whole world, with only a few exceptions, people and governments openly supporting the call for a ceasefire and the call for political resolution of the conflict so that Israel and Palestine have equal rights. And you see this in UN resolutions, 153-2, asking for a ceasefire. You see it in the demonstrations all over the world. Now you see it in the university encampments, starting in North America and spreading around the world. Never have we had this kind of intensity. And this tells us something, which we can get into a little bit later. But this is not just another ordinary Israel-Palestine clash, where Hamas fires rockets at the Israelis come back with their F-35s and 2,000-pound bombs and bomb the hell out of Gaza and essentially destroyed most of Gaza now. This is not a normal new phase. This is an unprecedented level of intensity of warfare, massive global participation in the political struggle, and therefore, my conclusion as a Palestinian and a journalist, and I've been involved with this for 55 years, as Maria said, my conclusion is that the Israelis understand that the traditional manner in which they've been able to have total Western support for anything they want to do, that era is coming to an end. And therefore, they're doubling down. The Israeli government and its supporters in the West are working overtime to spread their views, which I would generally call mostly propaganda, but they spread their views more intensely than ever before. And this comes down to 2 points, which the media has to understand. They double down on the Holocaust, and which the Holocaust is the worst thing that ever happened in the world according to Western, morality and ethics. That is, it's the image of the worst thing that humans do to each other, the killing of 6 million Jews, deliberate, focused mainly on the Jews, with a few others, but mainly on the Jews. And the Israelis, so anytime they can, they talk about the Hamas like Hitler or like the Nazis. The second thing that the Israelis are doing is focusing on accusing anybody who opposes Israel of being an anti-Semite. And anti-Semitism is linked, of course, to the Holocaust, but started way before. It started, centuries before. But anti-Semitism is also in the Western world, and that's what Israel really cares about. They don't care about Africa and Asia and Venezuela and stuff like that. They care about London, Bonn, Washington, the Western capitals, and Europe. And anti-Semitism in the West is, along with the Holocaust, the worst thing that humans do to each other. There's other things that are similar, racism, gender discrimination, but anti-Semitism has a special ring of inhuman cruelty and inhumanity. And so if you look at what the Israelis are doing, the accusations they make against anybody about their International Criminal Court, against governments that support Palestine, against student demonstrators. They call them anti-Semites and purveyors of Hitler and the Nazi genocide. So that's why these things together make this a really unprecedented moment. And journalists have to work overtime to sort out what's the propaganda from what's the truth, and where do you go to find the truth?
Okay.
What do you believe? So that's my initial quick comments.
Mm-hmm. These are very interesting, and of course, there's a lot of what oftentimes media fails to mention is that a lot of the protesters in the States, particularly, are Jewish. There's, for example, Voice for Peace, which is the biggest Jewish organization that is opposing what is currently happening in Gaza. A lot of the students who are arrested are Jewish students. And we've seen very little of that kind of reporting in mainstream media. I was particularly struck 2 days ago in a Bulgarian newspaper. The title it's called Sega, which is generally a good newspaper, but the headline was 100 pro-Hamas students arrested in the U.S. And so there is this immediate link between anybody who opposes what's currently happening in Israel to support for Hamas. How did that process happen? Could you like give us like a little history of that?
Sure. If you have 6 hours, I can do that, but I'll give it to you in 6 minutes. I've studied this for all my life. Ever since I was in college in the United States, which was 55 years ago, I've been engaged in a constructive way with pro-Israeli people, Jewish people, people who support Israel, to discuss with them, debate, have panel discussions, try to understand where's the problem and how can we solve it peacefully for everybody's rights to be ensured. And what I've learned over this 55 years, I've kind of, I took time in the last couple of months to document the history of the different, I call them propaganda points, talking points, with the propaganda that the Zionist movement before the State of Israel and since then the State of Israel, what they have done. And they have a very successful history of saying things from Israel that the West believes and the West uses to create its policies. And therefore, you have a situation where the US and England and Germany and a few others will not have a ceasefire. They want Israel to keep killing and attacking, and they will keep sending money and arms and ammunition to Israel as much as it needs. That's a consequence of very, very successful Zionist and then Israeli propaganda and political lobbying. Now, everybody does that. Propaganda and lobbying are not crimes. They're just normal human behavior. All of us do that. But in this case, the consequence of that is a crime. It's the crime of genocide, as well as the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the whole conflict. But the issue here is that I think this moment is so important, and puts an extra burden on journalists to sort it out. This is so important because it has shattered all the basic principles of the last 100 years of the conflict. And I mean by that the Israeli assumptions about Palestinians being, docile and they're under control and they're not going to threaten us anymore. Israel thinking that it has new peace agreements with Arab governments and therefore everybody is going to live in peace with it, without Israel having to change its policy to the occupation and settlement of Palestine. All of these things, Israel making the world believe that it's got an invincible army, nobody can threaten Israel, and of course Hamas showed that's not true. And then the point that Israel always makes, that Israel is the most democratic and moral military force in the world and never hurt civilians, etc. And that's been shown to be not true because of what's going on. So Israel is in a very difficult moment of seeing in practice the end of the success of its century of propaganda and public relations and lobbying, which again, I say are not crimes, but they've led to crimes and they've led to mass suffering. And that's why there's such massive global support for Palestine and for equal rights. It's important to know that the people who support Palestine and a ceasefire and who wear a keffiyeh and who say intifada, they're not talking for a new Holocaust of the Jews. They're talking for equal rights for an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, which a Hamas leader repeated 3-4 days ago in an interview in Turkey, saying that if the Israelis stop the war and get out of Gaza and we can live a normal life, we will negotiate, we were ready to negotiate, and if there's a peace negotiation that leads to a return to the 1967 borders, and Israelis and Palestinians each have their own state, that Hamas is willing to live in peace with Israel forever. So this is something that has been said many times on the Palestinian side, but it's not picked up by the media. So the Israelis feel that they can keep doing what they've always done, but the reality, if you look at public opinion polling, if you look at the polls of CNN did a poll 3 days ago in the US that showed that 81%, that's 4 out of every 5 people between the ages of 18 and 34, that is the young people, 81% of them disagree with the way the war is going in Gaza and disagree with the American support for it. This is an extraordinary figure. 20 years ago, it would have been the opposite. 80 or 90% would have said, yes, Israel's doing great, the US should support it. There's been a massive change in public opinion all around the world. And you see it in the demonstrations in Sydney and in Brazil and in India, wherever, Indonesia, all over the world, the people, Europe, they're demonstrating for Palestinian rights. So the Israelis are in a situation where they see that their traditional successful policies have stopped working and they don't quite know what to do about it. And so this is a particularly important moment for the global media to report more accurately, which means more comprehensively about what's happening in Gaza and Israel. So if Western journalists they feel Israel is right and the Palestinians are terrible, they can quote Israelis saying that if they want. But if that's all they do, they're just propaganda agents for the Israelis. And if they do the same for Palestine, they're propaganda agents for Hamas and Palestinians. So the reality here is that the new situation in Palestine and Israel, the new situation globally in terms of political support and expression, needs a new kind of media coverage. A media coverage that is more fair to both sides. And good media has to represent all the views of the people involved. If they only represent one view, they're not an independent media, they're a propaganda agent or whatever they want to be. And they're free to do that if they want, but they shouldn't expect to get a lot of readers and viewers, except for the people who agree with them. And that's not particularly useful. If you're just giving your people who agree with you more of what they want, you're not playing a very significant role as a media, as journalism. And I think, Dimitri, you and I hope most of the people listening here feel that the media has a responsibility to society like doctors do and like engineers do. We don't manufacture furniture, or nothing wrong with that, or we don't just do something in society that's for our own purpose to make money. We have a moral responsibility in society that society has given us by giving us the freedom to report. And that moral responsibility is to reflect accurately what's going on in society. Let the audiences, the citizens, get the truth from both sides of a conflict, and let the audience decide who it wants to support. And this is the political process. The political process is different than the media process. But the media situation has, and I'll mention this a little bit later, the media is a central player in the situation, because it has been a central player in allowing us to achieve this, to reach this point where we have a genocide happening and massive suffering and massive political responses to it all over the world. So that's a really important point to understand, not just how the media should do a better job, but why it needs to do that, the moral and political responsibility that the media has.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, because there was an internal memo that leaked out from the New York Times just a couple of days ago, where words like genocide, ethnic cleansing, occupation, even words like Palestine and refugee camps were to be avoided by journalists, which I think is quite unprecedented. Again, I think comparing to the war in Iraq, where criticism of U.S. policy was pretty rampant, pretty free to express in the media. A lot of the big Western media were very critical of the U.S. intervention in Iraq and what that led to, and yet we don't see the same kind of criticism being that kind of media being open to the same kind of critical view of Israeli policy in Gaza. I wanted to ask you something as somebody who is an observer of the region, and I suppose you're following the media situation in both Israel and Palestine. Could you and because I think as foreign observers, we often tend to group all people in the same camp, that all Israelis have a certain kind of share certain kinds of views, or all Palestinians share certain kinds of view, which we know, of course, is not true. There are multiple movements and perspectives in each of these communities. I mean, even right after October 7th, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz came out with editorials asking for Netanyahu to step down. And as we know, a lot of Israelis do not support Netanyahu's government. But could you give us a sense of what the media coverage is like in Israel and in Palestine currently, and are there different sort of views currently on the war?
Yes, I think it's clear I haven't been to Israel during the war, but from following it closely and talking to many Israeli friends, it's clear that the majority of Israeli people, big majority, support the war that's going on for various reasons, which we don't have time to get into, but many political, psychological, emotional, they are supporting the government. But they also want the government to get the Israeli hostages out of Gaza, and therefore they're putting pressure on Netanyahu. And so you have different kinds of sentiments, but the overwhelming sentiment is that the Israelis should keep going and really destroy Hamas, so that the Israelis never get attacked again the way that happened on October 7th. The reason for this is partly their own personal, psychological, political response to being attacked, but it's also because their media, the Israeli media, is not reporting the details of what's going on in Gaza, the nature of the deaths, the number of the deaths, the cruelty of the Israeli attacks, etc., which are reported widely in the Arab media, in the international press a little bit, and in some of the alternative media, the more independent, progressive media in Israel and in the West. You get much more clear reports about what the Israelis are doing, which is not just cruel and excessive, but is also in many cases criminal, acts of crimes of war and genocidal, as the UN court said. The Palestinian media has been pretty consistent throughout. The Palestinian media does not, and the Arab media don't have a tradition of independence from the state like the Western media generally do, and the Israeli media is kind of in between. The Israeli media, when there's a war going on, they're completely with the government. when there's no war going on, you get a lot of variety in Israel. There's a tremendous vitality to the Israeli media, which is predominantly a commercial media. It's like the political system. It's full of small groups, but then when there's a war, they all support the Israeli government. So the media really, in a way, reflects society, and at the same time, the media shapes public attitude. So the reason so many Israelis support the war is because the media has not shown them the full impact of the war in Palestine or even around the world, the anti-Israeli pressures. Therefore, the media is not really giving the public in Israel a full, accurate view of all the dimensions of this war. So the media in this case and in many other cases both reflects sentiments in society, but also helps to shape them in many ways.
And do you have a sense of how the war is being reported in the wider Arab world? Because I read this essay by you about resistance and revolution, that we have this a lot of autocratic Arab governments which are trying to propagate, let's say, anti-imperialist, anti-US policy. On the other hand, you have the so-called revolutionary movements within these countries, let's say Iran, people who are trying to topple these sort of autocratic governments who are being suppressed by their own governments, right? I mean, we saw this during the Arab Spring as well. And currently there are a lot of arrests also in some Arab countries because there are a lot of pro-Palestinian supporters, and yet the governments themselves, although they pretend to be pro-Palestinian, they're displaying a certain kind of realpolitik, perhaps, or a certain kind of disengagement from the conflict. So, do you have a sense of how this conflict is being covered in Arab countries currently?
Well, the Arab countries are peculiar in the sense that ever since the modern Arab system of countries came into being, which was about 100 years ago, about the same time as the conflict between Palestine and Israel started, the Arab state system has never been democratic and remains today the only region in the whole world that, as a region, is totally non-democratic. There isn't a single really democratic country in the region. There isn't a single Arab country where the citizens have defined what the state is, what the state's policies should be, what are the rights of citizenship, what are the responsibilities of the government. That's never happened. So we've never had a self-determinant Arab citizenry, and we've never had a state, a country, that has, in the Arab region, that has been validated by its own people. Now, you have this in other places around the world as well. You have autocratic and authoritarian, but there's no other part of the world where the whole region is like this. There's something about the Arab region, and this is something that political scientists, historians, psychiatrists are all trying to figure out. Why is the Arab region like that? And there's many, many reasons, which we don't have time to get into. They have to do with history, with foreign militarism. For instance, you've had nonstop military intervention in the Middle East by foreign powers, nonstop since Napoleon, since 1798. It's unbelievable. There's no other part of the world where that's the case. And the foreign military intervention, by the way, is increasing. If you look at the US and Great Britain and others, what they're doing indirectly by helping Israel and Arab autocrats, and directly they're fighting themselves against people in the region. And now you've got Iranians, you've got Turks, you've got all kinds of other people. The Russians are there. So there's many reasons why this region is like that. But the fact that it's like that means that the governments have pretty much total control over what the media does. And the media essentially tries to find the middle ground between what the government wants it to do and the public opinion of the people that it should respond to. And this is where you start getting tensions, because the governments in the Arab countries, and they've shown it in this situation, they're not going to get very involved in any aspect of this war between Hamas and other Palestinians and Israel. The Arab governments don't want to be involved. Some of them are trying to help mediate, which is a good thing. But they're not going to stick their neck out. Most Arab governments don't like Hamas. They don't like radical, militant, Islamist or leftist movements. Therefore, they'd rather Hamas didn't exist, but they can't do anything about it. So they just they send food and whatever they can do, but they don't do anything serious. The public opinion, on the other hand, in Arab countries is extremely supportive of the Palestinians and extremely critical of the Israeli government and Western governments. And by extension, they're critical of their own government, their own Arab government's lack of support for the Palestinians. And then when you look at the citizens of the Arab region, they're very openly, and this is now documented many, many times in polls and surveys around the region, you get 85 to 90% of Arab public opinion saying that they see Palestine as their cause, they support the Palestinian people, they'll never make peace with Israel except when Israel makes peace with the Palestinians. So this is a very nuanced situation where the Arab world is saying we reject living with Israel now because Israel is an occupier and now a genocider, but we will live with Israel if it withdraws from the occupied territories of 1967 and lives in peace with the Palestinians on equal rights. So, and this is probably more complex and more sophisticated than most average foreign correspondents feel is their job to report to their people. So a typical, say, Bulgarian or French or Spanish journalist may not feel it's his or her responsibility to give you these nuanced differences of within the Arab world, you have governments, you have popular opinion, and then you have another new force now, which is amazing, which of course is directly in this conflict, which is the non-government armed actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Ansarullah in Yemen, and many others, most of them supported by Iran. So they are the people who are fighting Israel now. It's not the Arab governments. The Arab governments just want nothing more than to end this conflict and sign peace agreements and just try to let the people of the region develop and have a normal life. So the media tends to find itself in a situation in the Arab countries where it's trying to balance public opinion and government views on Hamas and Palestine, which are different from each other. And therefore, it tends to be very bland and doesn't say, it just gives you cliches and not very much. One of the few areas where this is different is in Jazeera. In Jazeera, for some reason, the Qatari government, which created and funds Jazeera, for some reason, which a lot of people still can't figure out what it is, but Jazeera is a very serious, credible news service, Arabic and English. They're a little bit different, but they essentially try to report accurately about what's going on in the region and in Palestine and everywhere around the world. This has provided one source for people in Arabic, if they want, of really serious reporting about the different perspectives within the Arab countries on Palestine. So there are subtleties in the coverage which reflect the subtleties and the nuances and the differences within the Arab countries. As I said, the Arab countries are not, no country is completely one-dimensional. So you have Arabs who say we should just forget about Palestine, sign an agreement with Israel. Others who say we should keep fighting the Israelis, we should do this, we should boycott the Americans. This is normal human life, but these are, Arab countries are not normal governments, not normal societies, because the citizen really has very little rights, very few rights. And therefore, this is reflected in the media. So one of the things we need to do is to acknowledge what an unusual thing it is that Qatar has done to create Al Jazeera, which does give you a much more honest and wide-ranging view of the different attitudes on all issues, not just on Palestine, Israel, on issue of women, on issue of labor, and youth, whatever. And let's hope that at some point there is movement in the Arab countries to try to create more democratic, more responsible and accountable societies. The Arab uprisings you mentioned from 2010 to 2020 were an attempt to do this, a really heroic attempt, but they didn't work because the governments clamped down and foreign countries supported the governments. And this is one of the problems that we have.
Before we open up to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you a final question, which is, I know it's not connected necessarily to the media, but since you're an expert on the region, I wanted to ask you, how do you see this conflict ending? I mean, I know it's hard to talk about this in a few minutes, but because I feel so hopeless in the way the current situation is going. We've been talking about the two-state solution forever, but as most experts would say, that would probably is a dead end at this point. There's so much hostility on both sides and so much polarization. Is there and also no leadership on either the Palestinian or Israeli side? It's a failure of leadership, I think, on both sides. So where do we go from here, Rami?
Well, a lot of people have been discussing this for my entire lifetime. I was born in 1948 when this conflict started, and nobody has a clear answer. What is clear, I think, a few things, and I've spent much of my adult life engaging with Israelis, with pro-Israeli Westerners, Jewish people, Christian people, all kinds of people in the Muslim world. I've lived in the Middle East for the last 50 years. Now I live in the United States because I'm retired and our grandchildren are here, so I'm focusing on that. I've discussed this all my life with people on all sides. I've done research between Israelis and Palestinians. And my impression is that we can conclude a few things. Both sides have rights. So this is not a situation where one side is right or one side is wrong. Both sides have certain rights. They're not exactly the same, but you have to deal with both people seriously and equally. The second question is, both people have rights to statehood of some sort. The UN approved that, and they've themselves approved that. The Palestinians and the Arabs have all offered Israel a peace plan, that we live with you as a peaceful state. So this is a question also that has to be debated and resolved by negotiations. But statehood for both people is something that is acceptable. The third thing we can say, neither side is going to surrender to the other. The Israelis have shown, the Jewish people in history and the Israelis in modern history have shown a very tenacious, impressive commitment to fighting and dying for their rights, as most people do. There's nothing unusual about that. What's unusual is that the Jewish people were subjected to the worst kind of assault, the Holocaust, that has ever hit modern man and woman. But they've fought for their rights, and so have the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been fighting for a century for their rights in Palestine. So neither side is going to give up unilaterally. And what we now learn, neither side can dominate the other. So if you take those givens, what's the conclusion? My conclusion, which I've reached years ago based on my discussions with people on both sides and my research, is that there has to be a negotiated peace process that leads to a result where the Israelis have a state, the Palestinians have a state, or they have attributes of statehood that they mesh together in some kind of complex new formula. We might invent a new format for statehood. You have traditionally separate states, or you have confederated states, or you have one state for everybody. I think we're going to invent a new form of citizenship and statehood that converge. So you might have a sovereign Israeli authority and a sovereign Palestinian authority who take care of rights of people like passports or whatever, and justice. But they live together in one land where they share, for instance, water resource management or border controls or something like. So I think we're going to invent a new form of nationhood and statehood and citizenship. That has to be the way that this conflict is resolved, because neither side is going to win unilaterally. Neither side is going to surrender. Both sides have had traumatic historical experiences of different kinds. But there's something important to remember here. You know, the Israelis keep harping back to biblical times and their exile in Babylon. And then when they came back from Babylon and created their small little Jewish states in Judea and Samaria for a couple of hundred years, and then they were thrown out by the Romans. The Babylonian exile of the Jews, which was a central element of their history and their psyche, that we have to understand how important that was. But the Jews have to understand, and the world has to understand, the Israelis have to understand, that the Palestinian exile now, since 48, is 10 years longer than the Babylonian exile was. So the Babylonian exile, depending on how you read the Bible, is around 65, 70 years. We've been in exile for over 75 years now. And so these are two mighty people. Really, I use the word mighty. These are two impressive people. And it's a tragedy that they're fighting each other, but they will continue to fight each other because that's what human nature does. When people are subjugated, they resist. When people are occupied, they try to liberate themselves. When people are silenced, they try to speak up. And we have so many examples of this. I mean, there's a heroism that you see in the Palestinian struggle, which is continuing today, which is unbelievable. But it's not reflected globally because it counters the Israeli image that the Palestinians are terrorists and bad guys, etc. And the Israelis have impressive things in their history and the Jewish history, which people in the Arab world don't emphasize very much because they're at war with Israel. They don't want to say nice things about the Israelis. So the result in the end is any kind of peace that comes about, and there has to be some negotiated settlement, which will involve serious international involvement for mediating the negotiations and guaranteeing the peace. Serious international involvement beyond the United States. The United States has proved to be not a fair mediator and not a capable mediator. They're very much on Israel's side. They say it all the time, and it shows in the fact that they've had 30, 40 years of almost a monopoly on the negotiations, and they've gotten nowhere. So the other big powers around the world, Europe, Russia, China, whatever, people have to be regional players like Turkey and others have to be involved. And this is not going to happen very soon because the leaderships on both sides are more war-oriented, but it will have to happen at some point. It could also drag on for another 100 years. It's not out of the question. The population figures, the proximity of the populations to each other, all of these are not tending to make you hopeful that they're going to solve it tomorrow, but they do also indicate that if people feel they must continue fighting for their own safety, they'll continue fighting.
Yes, and it's obviously that there are various events like the elections in the U.S. in November and so on that could completely affect the conflict in many directions. But before, I guess it's time to open up the floor because I think we have a couple of minutes. So Maria, are there any questions from the audience?
In fact, I don't see. Just a second. I think there is now. We have a question from Mikhaila Vacheva. Why does Biden seem to have so little leverage over Netanyahu? Why hasn't the international media been allowed to cover this conflict? In your opinion, of course, it's a complicated question.
Yeah, but they're good questions. The international media has not been allowed to cover the conflict in Gaza because the Israelis don't want it to. It's very simple. The Israelis don't want independent foreign journalists looking around and seeing what is going on. Of course, if there was an international media presence, they would be very critical of what the Israelis are doing, but they'd also be critical of what Hamas is doing. And there's no question about it. But the Israelis feel that they need to control the narrative. They need to shape how the world sees Gaza, sees Hamas as killers and Jew haters and Israel tormentors and Israeli eyes. And they want to control how the world sees them as a righteous, noble, law-abiding army. So, but that's not going to last very long. It'll be very soon that you're going to start seeing more international journalists going into Gaza and reporting about it, especially when more humanitarian aid flows. That will have to open up mechanisms for journalists to cover that. Why Biden can't pressure Netanyahu is a really important question and a really difficult one to answer. The general sentiment, which I agree with, is that Biden could force Netanyahu to stop the war tomorrow if he wanted to, but he doesn't want to. And that's the important part of the answer. He doesn't want to force Netanyahu because he is afraid that if he pushes too hard on Netanyahu, Netanyahu is going to push back with all of the instruments of power that the Israeli government has developed in the United States over 100 years of lobbying and partnership and activity to make Biden lose the election and have Trump come in, who's much more friendly to the Israelis. And it's very clear. Dimitri mentioned the election year in the United States. Something really important has happened this year, which is unprecedented. And, unprecedented in all human history. What happened was that the Palestine issue, Gaza, the ceasefire, the genocide, the American support for Israel, the Palestine-Israel issue has become a domestic American issue in the election. It's quite extraordinary. And it's already been shown in the primary elections in Michigan and other states that people will use the elections to send a message to Biden to say, we will never support what you're doing. We will never vote for you. We don't care who's president. We cannot vote for you if you're supporting a genocide in Israel. And the sentiment that created this started with Arab American and Muslim American groups in Dearborn, Michigan. But it grew to include African Americans, women's groups, student groups, church groups, labor unions, all kinds of other Hispanic groups, all kinds of other groups. Many of them were marginalized historically, minority Americans that the government didn't pay attention to. And many of them were just ordinary mainstream Americans, including a lot of Jewish groups and church groups who were appalled by the American policy in relation to the ethics that they learned in their synagogues and in their churches about how to behave as a decent human being who loves God or fears God. So this coalition of groups that has told Biden, we're going to not vote for you if you keep doing this, scares the hell out of the Americans. And we're going to see now what happens. And this is another reason why the United States so far has not forced Netanyahu to change, because they're afraid that Netanyahu will then go and manipulate using or try to influence the election using the techniques that are perfectly legal in the United States. Election financing, voter mobilization, public propaganda, media activity. These are all legal things. There's nothing illegal about them. But the Israelis are very good at using them, even though they're having more limited effect these days because people see what is happening in Gaza. So it's a moment of change, and Biden is really not sure. Should he pressure Netanyahu or should he just leave things alone? And this is one of the fascinating things about living in a democratic country, because you don't know how the voters are going to vote once the voting day comes.
We have 3 more questions. The 2 of them are more complicated, political. The first one is on the media, so I will start with that. Maria is asking, could you talk about what impact of the failure of big Western outlets to cover the war properly will be on their authority and credibility.
On the which credibility?
The authority and credibility of the big Western media, if there is kind of a public agreement that they have failed to cover this conflict objectively and properly.
Well, it's clear that what I call the mainstream Western media, or the corporate media is a better word, because they are really corporations. Their job is to make money. And they make money by pandering to public opinion or pandering to advertisers, or both. That's how public corporations work. Some media that are not corporate, purely private profit-making, like the BBC, like NPR, and a few other state-supported ones, are a little bit better, but not much better, because they still have to compete for an audience. If you produce beautiful, radio and TV, and nobody's watching or listening, you don't exist. You're wasting your time. So the mainstream media, whether it's privately or publicly funded, has pretty much behaved in the same way. They have historically represented the pro-Israeli views of events and not given the Palestinians equal time, or have not even humanized the Palestinians. This is the main weakness of the global Western media-dominated mainstream coverage. The main problem of it has been that the Palestinians are not there as full human beings. They're there as one-dimensional cartoon characters. They either fire rockets or they suffer. And there's nothing in between. You don't see the computer science students in universities. You don't see the farmers trying out new techniques of water conservation. You don't see the students in laboratories trying to come up with better vaccines. You don't see the ordinary life of people going to the grocery store. You don't see, but you do see this with the Israelis. One of the amazing things here in the West, watching the media cover, is how the West has gone over time and overboard to humanize the families of the hostages that Hamas took to captivity. The Western media has done a spectacular job of showing you the full humanity of these people, their families, their cousins, their friends. And until today, this morning, I watched morning TV. It's amazing. They just keep going back to that story of the Israelis and the Jews suffering at the hands of Palestinian terrorists. That still dominates mainstream media in the West. But it doesn't dominate it 100% like it used to. It dominates it like 75%. And it's changing. This is what's so historic now, that there's change, as I mentioned, because of young people, because of the nature of the Israeli genocide, because the Palestinians are speaking to the world. The old system is slowly falling apart, slowly corroding and eroding and dissipating. The media, the main problem with the biased nature of the media coverage is that it conditions the public in a certain way to basically support Israel, which then allows the political leaderships in these countries, you see it in Germany, Great Britain, and the US most clearly, Canada a little bit, it conditions the citizens to allow the public leadership, the political leadership, to maintain a pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian position. But even that's changing, because these political leaders are now being taken to court for being complicit in a genocide. And with the ruling of the International Court of Justice, that kind of accusation suddenly can happen, and it has legitimacy, and it scares the daylights out of political leaders in the West and in Israel. Israel, 2 days ago, the Israeli leadership made it clear that it was worried that the International Criminal Court was going to issue summons, and this scares the daylight out of them. So what we're seeing is a continuation of traditional pro-Israeli biases, but there's a bit less than they used to be, and they're going to continue becoming less and less until we reach a point where policies change and you hopefully end up with the Israelis and the Palestinians in some kind of permanent peace negotiation. That is what the majority of people around the world want.
So there are 4 more questions. I suggest we take them, and that could be it. This is a good one. I think it's very clear for also it would bring more understanding in the Bulgarian society. If the conflict in Gaza were to conclude and the two-state solution were to be established, do you think Palestinians would permit Hamas to govern the newly formed country? Would Hamas govern, and what would that mean? Because what we usually hear, I will quote an analyst in my program, for example. I asked a similar question, and he said this cannot happen because this would be a terrorist state, terrorist paradise. I'm quoting a person who I was interviewing. I believe is generally a good international expert, but that was his opinion, that if a two-state solution would be made, then Hamas will run the country and it will still attack Israel.
Well, that's not only his opinion or her opinion, it's the opinion of the Israeli government and the right-wing fascist extremist branch of the government which now rules with the support of the people of Israel to carry out this genocide. So we're dealing with a very unusual situation where the most vicious, violent people are running Israel. And because of what happened on October 7, the emotional reaction in Israel is letting the people support the government, support this genocide, and causing many people around the world, like the person you mentioned, to say, well, you know, Hamas is a terrorist group and they're going to run a terrorist state. Most people who do this, who say these kinds of things, have probably never met somebody who is with Hamas, don't understand the reasons why this conflict has gone on for 100 years. Some of them might, but most of them don't. And therefore, they just repeat what the Israelis have conditioned them to repeat. And therefore, we're seeing this now still being expressed in many Western outlets, but a little bit less than before. The answer to the question is, I think, my guess is, it depends on how Hamas governs. It depends on if Hamas still exists as a resistance movement. Hamas's raison d'etre, Hamas is an acronym in Arabic for Harak al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which means the National Resistance Movement. Their main aim is resistance, and their main form of resistance is armed resistance. And they came about in the late 1980s, only because for the previous 40 years, the Palestinian leadership under the PLO and Arafat and others, and then Oslo, and they were total failures. They couldn't do anything. And therefore, they turned to armed struggle, as many resistance movements all around the world have done. And if you look at European history, I'm sure every European country that's ever been occupied has had an armed resistance movement. It's human nature. Has nothing to do with Hamas or Islam or Palestine. It's human nature. Occupied people resist. Subjugated people resist militarily. They try to find a political resolution that frees them. And if there's no political movement, they pick up arms and resist with arms. It's just human nature. It's been there for thousands and thousands of years. If Hamas succeeds in joint action with other Palestinian groups to get into a negotiation with the Israelis and reach a settlement where you have two states living side by side, you're going to have a very dynamic competition for leadership in Palestine. We already had the elections, and of course, in 2006, and Hamas won. This is how they got into leadership position. They won. They didn't have a majority, but they had a plurality, and therefore they ran the government. And then, of course, the Americans and the Israelis and Fatah overthrew them. But the answer to that question is that the people will select the government that serves the people best. And the Palestinians are very sophisticated people. They're very rational people. If Hamas does a great job of governing, they will choose Hamas. But Hamas will no longer be an armed resistance movement because if there is a peace and you have two states, there's no need. And Hamas has said this many times. The minute we achieve our political national liberation and our equal rights with the state with Israelis, we will no longer need our armed resistance. They've said this openly, but nobody wants to listen to them. Nobody wants to hear them. By the way, if anybody's interested in Hamas, starting on Thursday, me and a friend of mine, a British journalist, are going to have a 6-part, what do they call them, podcast, once a week every Thursday, just about Hamas. And we're not supporting Hamas or criticizing Hamas. We're exploring what is Hamas and why does it matter. And we're doing this by interviewing the top scholars, Arabs and foreigners, who have studied Hamas for the last 30, 40 years. It's going to be one of the most important mechanisms by which people around the world who are interested in this can learn what is Hamas. And then they can make up their mind. Are they terrorists? Are they good guys? Are they somewhere in between? This is something, I'll send you the notice and you can share it with your audience if they're interested. But that's the answer really to the question. If Hamas governs well, they can be chosen. If not, they will have somebody else will be chosen.
You should definitely send us the link. I believe we all need to improve our knowledge on what this movement is. Another question, how would you comment on the synchronized decision by several Western countries to stop funding the United Nations Palestinian Agency shortly after the International Court's decision to open an investigation into Israel for potential genocide?
Well, that was a fascinating moment. That when on the same day that the International Court of Justice released its initial findings that there's plausible cause to see a genocide, that Israel is committing a genocide, the same day that happened, Israel released a statement saying that they have evidence that thousands of Palestinians who work for UNRWA, UN Relief and Works Agency, that serves Palestinians for education, healthcare, etc. The Israelis said, we have evidence that a dozen or so Palestinians were in Israel on October 7. They were, employees of the UN were there with the attack. And then they said there's thousands of others who are members of Hamas. Of course, immediately the Western world was shocked, and I think about 14 countries, including the biggest ones, Germany, the US, UK, they've suspended their funding of UNRWA. Not everybody did, but many did. Once the world started looking into this, and the countries that suspended their funding asked the Israelis, please show us the evidence. The evidence that was produced was totally unbelievable. It had no credibility. It had no factual, real evidence. And after maybe a month or more, people who stopped their funding resumed their funding. Not everybody, but 4 or 5 of the countries that had stopped funding UNRWA resumed funding because the Israelis were lying. They were lying openly because this is how they were successful historically. They would make an accusation, very dramatic. The other one was on October 7, babies having their heads cut off, that Hamas cut the heads off decapitated babies or burned babies in ovens. Complete lie, no evidence for this whatsoever. Even the accusation of systematic sexual violence and rape still has not been fully documented, and people are still trying to find out, did this happen or not? Was it systematic? Was it all done by Hamas? And these are all techniques that Israel uses to shape public opinion. Of course, the media picked these things up immediately and printed them. And I can tell you from talking to senior people in the Western media now, they tell me that if Israel issues a statement, if the army issues a statement, we're going to double check it before we print it. We're going to ask for evidence. We're going to ask for confirmation. We can't just believe what the Israeli army says anymore because they've lied to us too many times. And the UNRWA was a very dramatic example of this, to the point where most of the people who stopped funding have resumed funding. And this is one of the reasons why the Israelis are so terrified today, because they're seeing that their traditional approach of propaganda and public relations spin that is heavily based on either total lies or distortions or exaggerations is not working like it used to. And they don't quite know what to do other than what they're doing, which is just call people anti-Semites and say that anybody who does anything against Israel is like the Nazis in the Holocaust. And that's a terrible tragedy. What a terrible way for the Jewish people to relive their most traumatic human experience in the modern world. But this is something their leadership has chosen to do, and it's incumbent on all of us, journalists and others, to work with the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Arabs and everybody to get away from this historical pattern of ineffective propaganda and try to zero in on the realities of how can we give both these people their rights. This is the imperative. How do we find that middle ground where Israelis and Palestinians can actually coexist in peace, which I believe they can, based on my long experience of interacting with them and with others. So we're really living through a momentous historic moment, and the opportunity for Western journalists in Bulgaria and anywhere else, the opportunity to really show the best of journalism is now right there on our doorstep, and we should grab it.
I think it's very important, the line you drew between leadership and the people, because this is basically every state which is at war is using lies and propaganda. I mean, this is a general rule, and it's good that media learn to double check. Problem is whether you have a proper opportunity to double check, because it's extremely complicated with this conflict, in particular, this war. Two more questions, I would say final ones, because we're taking quite much of your time, but it's, I believe, very, very important for us. If Biden is afraid of Netanyahu meddling with the election in the US, and that's why he's not taking he's taking his side, isn't it the opposite true now, that it is exactly because of taking his side that he will lose, or that he might lose?
That's very possible, yes. So I would just add one thing, that Biden being afraid of Netanyahu meddling in the election is not the only reason why Biden is supporting Netanyahu. Biden feels very strongly that Israel and Zionism are a cause that are close to his heart. He said this many times. But he's a function of the successful propaganda of the last 100 years. I mean, Biden is over 80 years old, so his life has been almost as long as the whole Zionist experience and the modern Israeli experience. Biden is sincere when he says that. I don't say he's lying. He really genuinely believes that Israel is special and must be protected at all costs. But he lets that sincerity override his rational acknowledgement that Israel is committing war crimes and genocide. And it's also causing political problems for people in the US, especially the Democratic Party. So he's caught in between these two things. He has to decide, what is the job of a political leader? Where is his political responsibility? Where is his moral responsibility? Is it just to be reelected, or is it to do the right thing and teach the populace, the people, teach the population what is the right thing to do, which has to be based on justice, the rule of law, religious ethics, and any other criteria that you want to choose. And this is where American politicians mostly fail the test, and maybe all politicians mostly fail the test around the world. I can't generalize because I don't know them all, but from what I've seen, this is pretty common. This is one of the problems of democracy, is that it can be manipulated. Public opinion can be manipulated. Most Americans, like most Bulgarians, don't sit around every morning and ask about what's going on in Palestine. Are the Israelis following the rules of international law? So that's not what people get up and do every day. This is a tangential issue to the lives of most people. But because it's a tangential issue, the Israelis understood 100 years ago that they could manipulate public opinion, and they could convince leaders to do things, Western leaders, to do things that are in the favor of Zionist movement and Israel, which they started doing in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration came out of London, saying we want to support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And the British made this statement when Palestine was 93% Arabs. And it was not a state, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. But it was 93% Arabs, and the British said, we support the creation of a Jewish homeland here. And that's how the process started. So the historical stuff has to be taken into consideration. This conflict did not just emerge suddenly, that somebody attacked somebody because they wanted their land. There are historical reasons why this happened. We need to acknowledge that. The readers and audiences of media should understand that when it's appropriate. And in this case, it's definitely appropriate because of the actions of Hamas cannot be seen in isolation or in a vacuum. What Hamas did in October 7 is something clearly not acceptable to most people around the world, but it did not also clearly come out of a vacuum. And to understand why it happened doesn't mean you support it. It means you understand why it happened. It means you focus on the reasons why Israelis and Palestinians have been fighting for 100 years, and to try to stop that process rather than to perpetuate it by fueling a genocide and fueling acts of militant resistance, and some of which are terrorism. And so we need to break this cycle, and the media has an important role to play in this.
There was one final question on the protests on the US campuses, but I believe you already spoke about it. So I would rather give the floor to Dimitar, if you want to ask something else or to conclude. We have 10 minutes. We've quite extended our time, but questions are running and there is so much to talk about. So Dimitar.
Yes, thank you. I think these are extremely important things that Rami said, and I was in particular interested in, I guess, the solutions for this conflict, because it seems to me, Rami, that we are using 19th century tools, that is nationalism, to solve a 21st century conflict, and I was wondering whether in this conflict we can find a solution, something that's beyond nationalism, because it is quite unfortunate that we are returning back to these ethno-nationalist ideologies that we thought were forgotten, and back, we left them in the 20th century, but in Europe we can see them everywhere, springing back to life. We can see them in Israel. We can see them also, as a Palestinian solution, that this is a national state is the solution. Have you heard of other? I mean, you talked about probably some kind of a new solution, whether it's a one state or whether it's like a federation. Is there any kind of like radical talk within certain Palestinian circles of other solutions that are beyond the national state?
The answer to that is no. I haven't heard of any other proposals, because I don't think there are any others. I mean, people have been discussing this for decades and decades. And I remember, in the early 1970s, after the 1967 war, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai and the Golan Heights, and Israel was at its peak of territorial expansion or occupation, people in the Arab world were passionately debating, what can we do? How do we end this? So this was like 50 years ago, in the early 1970s. I remember people discussing this. I was in Beirut then, and it's been going on ever since. And there just aren't any clear ideas about a new configuration that would satisfy the needs and rights of both sides. The difficulty here is that the Israeli side, Zionism, wants a Jewish state. It's an ethno-nationalist, superior ethnically superior, militant, racist apartheid system. And I use those words carefully because they say themselves, this land is only for the Jews to control. They're not openly respecting the rights of others. They see themselves as exclusively enjoying the rights of statehood and power in the whole land from the river to the sea. That's an expression they use as well. So this is apartheid, and you see it when you go there, of course. And it's hard to find a mechanism that would satisfy those views of the Zionists. That's why I say one of the critical things we need to do is to define and contain Zionism. Zionism for many Jews is a beautiful thing. It's a very positive thing. It helped them get out of a situation of terrible subjugation in mostly Eastern Europe and Russia in the 19th century when Zionism was born in the 1800s, 1880s. It was because of racist, apartheid, anti-Semitic sentiments in Europe, white Christian Europe, and North America a little bit. It was because of that that Zionism was born. And very few Jews supported Zionism, but those who did felt they needed to have a place where they could live as Jews. And therefore, many who came early in the process in the 1880s, 1890s, you were talking about a few thousand people, very few, very small numbers. But for them, that was a very important, positive thing. So, and then, of course, with the advent of the Nazis and anti-Semitism in Europe and the US, who refused to accept more Jews to come into the US and England by law, more people came to Palestine. And that's how the big problem happened when more and more Jews went to Palestine under the British between 1920 and 1947. Then you started to have clashes. Then the Arabs saw that the Jews were not coming just to live peacefully and pray in their ancestral land where they had associations. They wanted to create a Jewish state. So it's hard to find a mechanism that satisfies both the Zionist need for a Jewish exclusive ethno-nationalist apartheid state with the Palestinian demand for their rights in their ancestral land. A two-state resolution can do that. So if the Israelis want to be Zionist and only Jewish and racist and apartheid in their own state where there's nobody else but Jews, they're free to do that in theory. But if they want to live with Palestinians in one place, they can't do that. And so that I don't see any other solution. The solution has to be similar to what happened, say, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and which many of your colleagues will be, have lived through, the transition from the old Soviet Union to the new situation, which is still changing. I know it's early days, but also apartheid, how they changed. Northern Ireland, how they changed. There has to be a structural change in the substantive nature of the exercise of power, that you cannot have you say, well, now we're a democratic country, but these people still control everything. You need to have a structural change that lets ordinary people of whatever identity they are feel that they're living in a society that respects their rights and treats them decently. So this is something that people are working on overtime. I can tell you, Palestinians and Israelis are searching vigorously to how can we create a new mechanism. And if anybody in Bulgaria has views, we would love to hear them. We welcome them. The more discussion we get about equal statehood and citizenship in the land of Palestine, the more input we get towards that, the better it is for everybody.
Yes, certainly. Maria, do we have more time, or probably it's time for... No. Well, Rami, thank you very much for this. I hope that our audience has learned from this talk and is now better informed about the way media covers this conflict, not only in the US but around the world, the various complications connected to this, and of course, we should never forget that what is happening currently in Gaza is a tragedy, that thousands of people have already been killed, or almost 35,000, that tens of thousands have been injured, that millions are displaced, So these are not only numbers, and we should remember that this is a real human tragedy that is going on, and I think the media has the responsibility to expose this sort of injustices at whatever price. So I'm very happy that Rami could join us for this talk, and could give us a sort of an insider's view on the situation in the Middle East, and let us hope that there is some kind of light at the end of this tunnel, and that we're not going, that AI is not going to take over the way it's taking over weapons now. It's not going to take over journalism. That there's still a human element that we can rely on, and then we can discover our common humanity in all of this madness that we're living through. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Rami, again.
Thank you, Dimitar and Maria and everybody else. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm really happy I had this chance to interact with you, and I look forward to meeting some of you in person one day, inshallah.